The history of photojournalism has recorded many notable men and women, but especially in India, we have had photojournalists who have contributed a lot in their time and have recorded both political, cultural, and many other events. The pioneering Homai Vyarawalla was the only photographer with a public profile of a photojournalist in her time. We have with us Professor Sabina Gadi-Hoek, who's had the privilege to know Homai intimately for 15 years. She first met Homai in 1997 when she was making a film on 3 women photographers called 3 Women and a Camera. And subsequently, she wrote a book on her in 2006 called Camera Chronicles of Homai Vyarawalla. She has curated several exhibitions on her work. Let's go over to Professor Sabina Gadi-Hoek.
Hello and welcome to this short segment on Homai Vyarawalla, who was India's first woman press photographer from the late 1930s to 1970. My name is Sabina Gadi-Hoek and I teach at the AJK Mass Communication Research Center at Jamia Millia Islamia. Now, while it was not unusual for women to be part of a history of photography, photojournalism has not really been very accessible to them. One famous example that comes to mind is the American correspondent for Life magazine, Margaret Burke White. Then there are her fellow Americans, Dorothea Lange and Esther Bubbly, who also shot iconic images of the Great Depression in the 1930s. In India, while some women took photographs in domestic spaces, Homai Vyarawalla is quite pioneering in that she was the only photographer with a public profile as a photojournalist in her time. It's not surprising that the architect of our constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, once asked her, "How did you get into this rough crowd?" Creator of a rich archive of historical images, this lady in the rough crowd, as I called her, distinguished herself by photographing for over 3 decades. I was very privileged to know Homai intimately for 15 years. I first met her in 1997 when I was making a film on 3 women photographers. It was called 3 Women and a Camera, and subsequently I wrote a book on her in 2006 called Camera Chronicles of Homai Vyarawalla. I curated several exhibitions on her work. Ours was a long friendship and journey, but let us start at the beginning. Homai Vyarawalla was born in 1913 in Navsari in Gujarat, and you'd be surprised to know that she lived for almost a century, passing away in January 2012, just a month before her 99th birthday. Her father was an actor in a travelling Parsi Urdu theatre company and her mother was a homemaker. Homai belonged to the small but progressive and cosmopolitan Parsi community in India. She grew up in Bombay, where she was a student at the Sir J.J. School of Arts, and she learned photography from her then boyfriend Manekshaw during the 1930s. After her marriage, the couple moved to Delhi in 1942 to join the Far Eastern Bureau, which was the publicity wing of the British government during World War II. While both had been inducted as photographers, Manekshaw gradually moved away from active photography to take care of the darkroom and printing, while Homai's job profile required her to cover major events and significant people for what now became the British Information Services. She took iconic pictures of the transfer of power and the events around independence. So if you think of all those famous photographs like the swearing-in ceremony on August 14, 1947, the hoisting of the flag at Red Fort, the funeral of Gandhi a year later in 1948, and images of her favorite and photogenic subject, India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, they've all circulated widely. She also documented the early years of nation building, the creation of infrastructure like dams and steel plants, hospitals, as well as projects, all kinds of projects, educational, cultural institutions. She also captured the state visits of the most famous names in 20th century history. There was the Shah of Iran, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King, the Premier of Vietnam Ho Chi Minh, Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, the Russian leaders Brezhnev and Khrushchev, President Nasser of Egypt. I mean, these are just some of the names. And we can pause and look at some of these images. High society magazines like The Onlooker and The Current often requested Homai for pictures of what they called good-looking women. Not surprisingly, they published large spreads of her pictures during the visits of Queen Elizabeth I and the fashionable First Lady of the United States, Jackie Kennedy. Now, being the only woman photographing meant a certain advantage because Homai's presence was often noted. In many of her pictures taken during the royal visit to India in 1961, Queen Elizabeth looks directly at her like I'm looking at you in the camera. While her days were spent photographing political events, Homai inhabited a completely different world in the evenings when she was in great demand to photograph at clubs and embassies. Her pictures of fancy dress parties, fashion shows, theatre and dances reflect this cosmopolitan world of leisure. Let us now briefly move to the context of mid-century press photography in India. It was difficult for photographers to survive outside of the patronage of the government. Even freelance photographers needed to be accredited by the newly formed Press Information Bureau. Newspapers and magazines were the only source of employment for the professional. Homai's early photographs were published in magazines like the Jame Jamshed and the Bombay Chronicle and newspapers like the Statesman. Of course, the most preferred publication of the time was the Illustrated Weekly of India because of the quality of paper and its photogravure printing that enabled good reproduction. The weekly launched the careers of many photographers including Homai, but you'd be surprised to know that since she was unknown and a woman, her early photo features were initially published under Maneksha's name. Digitization of her work has revealed a vast archive of images of everyday life in Bombay and Delhi that also mark her as a fine documentary photographer. Let us now move to Homai's craft and technique. This was a moment when the aesthetics of pictorialism dominated. What is pictorialism? A style that sought to emulate painting with well-composed but somewhat static images of human and scenic beauty. Homai Vyarawalla and her colleagues in the press were marking a break with more candid images. Let us watch a clip from my film where Homai discusses a photograph of Nehru with Lord and Lady Mountbatten taken by the famous French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. He was also her contemporary, by the way. This photograph is an example of what Bresson termed the decisive moment, that precise second when all the elements of the picture fell into place. Now, Homai's critique of the image gives us insights about the aura and the reverence attached to the bodies of public figures in India. They just could not be photographed like in Bresson's picture. This is not surprising given that moment when leaders were heroes and photographers were also citizens who believed in the dreams that they offered them. There was another reason for this restraint too. India did not have a tradition of independent photography till much later. Of course, this restraint did not stop Homai from capturing candid moments like Bresson, but the method that she adopted was different. She was unobtrusive and she often waited for what she called the right moment when they were comfortable and all the other photographers had taken their pictures. What also emerges from the clip is Homai's determination about not compromising the dignity of her subjects. For instance, she did not exhibit a photograph of Nehru receiving Ho Chi Minh in 1958 publicly for many years. And why? Because it was taken very spontaneously as they chatted in a very animated manner, and the camera made it look like Nehru was pulling the Vietnamese premier's beard. In turn, Homai's subjects trusted her enough to let her photograph them in more private moments.
I don't like this picture at all because it makes our Prime Minister look more like a clown against these dignified people. After all, you have to show dignity in a person. not to make him look like a clown.
The American photographer Dorothea Lange once described the camera as an extension of her own body. The same could be said for Homai Vyarawalla, who was rarely seen without her speed graphics or Rolleiflex. The Rolleiflex was a twin-lens reflex camera that was held slightly lower. Now in Homai's case, this camera's slightly lower angle helped lend an aura to her subjects. This might explain the heroic look of her political subjects because you were always looking up at them, which was enhanced by her use of a daylight flash that gave their faces a glow. Both cameras could only take 8 or 12 exposures at a time, which meant that the photographer had to be much more economical and disciplined about framing. Homai was also very adept in the art of developing and printing. She had her dark room next to her kitchen. She measured chemicals like she measured spices instinctively with her fingers that were always stained brown. So like Dorothea Lange, her body carried an imprint of her photography too.
So I can see whatever is happening in that particular frame, at the same time what is happening around me. Then this is another viewfinder which I can use, which shows only the framing of the picture. And the focusing is done here, just like that, forward and backwards. So all in a hurry, I had just to shift this, take the picture, without any bother about focusing. And my pictures always used to come out proper focus. And after every shot, had to open this, remove the bulb, put it back, put another one. And I used to carry my camera like this on my shoulder, always. So this used to become the ashtray for the people, more or less. Other photographers would think their job is finished when they see the two people meet in whatever position, sitting down, standing, shaking hands or anything. And if they miss the picture, they would say, "Sir, please, please, shake hands again." I would just go on watching. I wouldn't take pictures after that, And then I would stay in one corner, just waiting for the right moment when they were unconscious of the cameras around them. And then I would just step forward, click and get out, So they would be surprised to see for the first time a woman coming out with a camera, and the very look on their face would be that of surprise and, all natural. And I would be getting the best of shots out of that.
Travelling solo all over the country, Homai Vyarawalla was ever ready for adventure. She took top-angle pictures of the Kumbh Mela perched on top of a moving fire engine, and she fell into the Yamuna when a pontoon bridge carrying devotees during a festival gave way. In 1956, she travelled to the Nathula Pass in North Sikkim to capture the first entry of the 21-year-old Dalai Lama, who entered on a pony. Stranded without transport in Gangtok, she had to hitch rides on passing jeeps. Photographing Muhammad Ali Jinnah the day before he left for Pakistan, she landed at his feet, crashing from a height that she had climbed to for greater depth. And of course, Jinnah smiled as everyone knew Homai Vyarawalla. As the only woman press photographer, Homai had a good working relationship with her male colleagues, many of whom lovingly nicknamed her Mummy. She shrewdly noted that this kept her on a pedestal, a survival strategy that she used to her advantage.
Karayappa used to call me, Energy. He never used to call me by my name. He just said, "Hello, Energy, how are you? Still climbing trees?" And Rajaji said I was a new phenomenon. All sorts of names I used to have. People used to be happy when they saw me. But I had that very stern aspect, no hanky-panky with me. Immediately anything went wrong, I would shout at the person and give him one good, bang also. So that sort of attitude, was observed by the photographers. So one of them, Mr. Satakopan, who was older by about 8 years than me, he started calling me Mummy. And when that Mummy word came out, all these others, started calling me, even the policemen, the security wallahs, everybody started saying Mummy, Mummy, Mummy.
Amita Malik, the well-known journalist, had once described her in The Statesman as a very young girl wearing a practical sari with a very becoming hairstyle. For years before she acquired her Fiat car, Homai rode a bicycle with her sari, weighed down by several cameras, bags of large flash bulbs and a wooden tripod. History is often considered to be a story of important events and famous personalities. But if we look more carefully, we begin to notice those who have been less visible, such as this woman dressed in a sari, who was a key visual chronicler of her times. It is for this reason that, like her famous peers across the world, the pioneering Homai Vyarawalla must be given her due place in a history of photojournalism.
In this video, we have learnt about the life and work of India's first woman press photographer, Homai Vyarawalla. Professor Sabina Gadi-Hoke has shared with us numerous anecdotes about her life and work. We hope that you found this video engaging, interesting, and inspiring.